More now on Ukraine, and let's take a look at what's at stake in that meeting on Friday between Presidents Putin and Trump in Alaska. As we've been hearing from the UK Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, he's been reiterating that international borders mustn't be changed by force. Our diplomatic correspondent Paul Adams has more on the territory being fought over in Ukraine.
The Alaska summit, Donald Trump's first face-to-face meeting with Vladimir Putin for 6 years, is a big moment. But it's also one fraught with risk. Let's look at who controls what in Ukraine and what might be at stake in any peace agreement. We need to go back to 2014 to see Vladimir Putin's first move, the occupation and annexation of Crimea. That was followed by a Moscow-backed separatist movement in the area known as the Donbass, specifically the two regions or oblasts known as Donetsk and Luhansk. A war simmered there for 8 years. But in February 2022, Putin launched his full-scale invasion. Russian troops reached the outskirts of Kiev and seized huge swathes of the south, including big chunks of two more oblasts, Zaporizhia and Kherson. The war has ebbed and flowed ever since. Russia now controls around 20% of Ukraine. In the east, Russian forces are advancing, but very slowly and at great cost. President Zelensky says that what's needed now is an unconditional ceasefire. But in the run-up to his Alaska summit with Putin, President Trump has started talking instead about territorial swaps, causing shockwaves in Kiev and across Europe. But what could these swaps mean, given that all the territory in question legally belongs to Ukraine? Let's look at the Donbass. Some reports suggest that Mr. Putin is demanding that Ukraine hand over the remaining territory it controls in both oblasts. But that would mean Kiev giving up on places which tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers have died trying to protect. For Kiev, such a concession would represent a bitter pill. Ukraine's leader, President Zelensky, says Ukraine will not leave the Donbass. What about Zaporizhia and Kherson? Here, it's reported, Russia is offering to halt its offensive and freeze the lines. But would Moscow be prepared to give any of it back? It seems unlikely. This is all part of Vladimir Putin's strategically vital land bridge connecting Russia to occupied Crimea. Putin regards all these places as part of Russia. For Ukraine and Europe, territorial swaps at this very early stage are a non-starter. A discussion about future borders may eventually come, but only when the war has stopped and Ukraine's future security has been guaranteed.
And earlier I spoke to Dan Saba, who is Defence and Security Editor at The Guardian and currently in Kyiv. I asked him how the front lines had evolved in this war.
What we saw, of course, is initially a surprise Russian invasion, unprovoked Russian invasion in February 22 that nearly threatened to envelop Kyiv. And the Ukrainians then threw that off quite quickly in the spring of 22 and pushed the Russians back. And on the face of it, you had a relatively static conflict since the beginning of 2023. It's become clear that the Ukrainians can't push the Russians out, and the Russians controlling something like 18%. Maybe a little bit more of Ukrainian territory. But that doesn't mean there hasn't been a little bit of ebb and flow, and there has been some movement on the front line. And it was this time a year ago that Ukraine tried to attack into Russia, but the Russians are now pushed in the Kursk area, but the Russians have now successfully pushed that back and squeezed them out. And now we're beginning to see an intensification of Russian pressure, Russian advances on the in the east, in the hottest part of the front, in around Donetsk Oblast, the territory actually that Vladimir Putin most badly wants. I mean, he wants all of Ukraine in many ways, but this is the area he most badly wants. And unfortunately, from Ukraine's perspective, and fortunately from Vladimir Putin's, we've seen in the last few days, over the weekend really, the piercing of the front line in a couple of places, these Russian saboteur groups advancing about 10 kilometers over the weekend near an important road junction, a small town called Dobropilya, but nevertheless an important area because it sort of begins to suggest that Russia might be able eventually, slowly, to encircle the big towns in Donbass like Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, the last place, the places, as I say, that Putin really wants, and the central fortress belt that protects the fortress belt in the eastern Donbass that protects central Ukraine.
Do you think, Dan, that it's no coincidence that those very recent advances that you've been talking about just now, so advances since the Alaska summit was announced, have happened? Has there been a concerted effort on both sides to try to make advances in the event of a ceasefire or whatever might come from these talks?
Well, there's absolutely a political element to this, and what Russia wants to show, and Volodymyr Zelensky said this actually on Tuesday at a briefing for journalists that I was at, and Zelensky said, look, these are political manoeuvres, and it's designed for the benefit of the US audience, and what the Russians are trying to say is, hey, we're winning this war, albeit slowly, and the message to the US is, look, don't throw don't throw good money after bad. Ukraine is slowly losing. Any arms you sell, anything you do to help Ukraine is a waste of time. We're going to win this war any which way, and that may also make Putin perhaps a little bit more confident in his negotiating position in Alaska. I don't think he's going to be in a mood to compromise very much. I mean, he hasn't been in a mood to compromise at any point in the last 3 years. But I think Donald Trump will be doing very well to get any further concessions out of Putin, because it's these kind of little tactical successes on the front that just make Russia keep thinking we can grind our way to a victory there. And of course, from Ukraine's point of view, this is part of the front line that they should be defending as hard and well as they can. It's difficult. They're outnumbered, in personnel terms, and they're doing their best. But even so, it is unfortunate and surprising that the front line was pierced in this way.
Dan Sabbah from The Guardian.